The very basic, simple understanding of our gospel today is the fact that Christ has come, Christ has died, and Christ will come again. He came to us first in the flesh, his presence veiled in flesh, asking people to see the deeper of meaning that God himself was in Jesus. His presence remains with us at every Mass and has for the last 2,000 years, the presence of God, body, blood, soul, and divinity, within the veil of bread and wine. And that veil of bread and wine will one day give way to the fullness and the manifestation of Jesus coming again. You'll hear in the Eucharistic prayer today, we long for his second coming. It was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. I was off this past week in the Sierra Nevadas in Southern California. I think they might consider it actually Northern California, I'm not sure. And I had a chance to catch up with a number of priest friends, and one of the priest friends I have works at a Newman Center in Kansas City, Father Nick. And Father Nick was sharing a story that he had taken some of the students from his Newman Center into the Texas wilderness, and they were not prepared. He wasn't. It was the first time he had ever actually done a desert excursion. He's been in the mountains, and one of the biggest problems, if you've ever been backpacking, you realize is that you need water. If you go in the mountains, water is fairly easy to find because almost all year round there's rivers flowing and you can easily replenish your water supply no matter how large your group is. But in the desert, you have to have certain points that you have to meet, otherwise you very easily could be near death because of dehydration. And so they had gotten some information before they went on this hike with about 7 or 8 young people in their early 20s. And the information was that they would find a good water source about 7 miles in. And so they had prepared their water sources for 7 days or 8 days. And as they began to walk through the wilderness, they made it that 7 miles, and sure enough, there was a water source there, but the water was so stagnant, Father Nick said, I don't think even a cow would have drank it from it. The next water supply wasn't for 4 miles. They were nearly out of water and still exhausted after a 7-mile hike in the desert with full packs. So they decided to press on to the next water supply because it was going to be shorter, taking the risk, of course, that the information that they got in the second water supply would actually be real. And after about halfway to that second water supply, they were taking a break when one of the women who was dehydrated started getting a little delirious. And as they were sitting down, she said, you know what? It was fun hanging out with everybody, but I'm going to go home now. And Father Nick said, you can't go home. It's now 9 miles back to the trailhead, and we don't have any water. You'll never make it. She didn't even realize he said what she was saying because she had been brought to this place of discomfort, this place where she knew that there was something more she had to depend on than physical realities. Gone from the comforts of home, gone from the ability to go to the faucet and turn it on to get a drink of water. Eventually they pressed on. They did indeed find another water source, were rehydrated, and they finished their hike several miles later, several days later. Today in our first reading is one of the greatest points in the history of Israel. In those days, there was always competition. It was sort of unwritten about whose God is stronger, whose God is more powerful. And when the Israelites were released from Egypt, it proved that God was stronger than Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians, all of his horses, all of his chariots, because they left Egypt freely. And remember, they crossed through the Red Sea, and God had sent the sea over all of the Egyptians, their horses and their chariots, and basically wiped them out. They were freed from Egypt. But the next step was the wilderness, the desert wilderness, and their wanderings. They wandered in that wilderness for 40 years. And many of them got tired. Why did God lead us out into this desert? We would rather be enslaved by the Egyptians. Because at least there we knew we had and could depend on some material things. We could depend on a meal. But now God has let us out here. And they began to grumble. Now, anytime you hear grumbling in the Old Testament, you have to think of rebellion. Because grumbling is the first sign of rebellion, right? Parents, you know this with children, right? Go make your bed. I got to make the bed. I don't like the bed. Well, right? The first step, guys, you're working at work, doing something, the boss tells you something you don't really want, you go to the other guy, hey, do you hear what the boss wants me to do? I don't want to do that. I don't really want to do that. First sign of rebellion is grumbling in the Old Testament. Still true today. What were they forgetting? They were forgetting trust in God. That first line that I quoted today, it was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, my Father gives you the true bread from heaven, was leading people to see an invisible reality and trusting in a God that they couldn't see. When it's so easy as human beings to always favor things that we can trust in, things that are tangible. But the problem is, friends, that never stretches our hearts. It never does. We so often are seeking happiness, but we settle instead for comfort. Pope Benedict was famous for saying to a group of young people, "You were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness." If the Packers had decided this year to adopt the philosophy that this year, we're going to be comfortable rather than great, we would quickly lose interest in the game. It was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. What is the true bread from heaven? Dependence on the only thing in this life that you can absolutely depend on, who is that invisible reality we call God. The God who Jesus Christ revealed to us as a Father who keeps his promises. Friends, every one of us in our lives can come to the point where maybe we've gotten bad information, or maybe where we believe that God has led us to a place that he can't get us through. We feel sometimes like we've been deceived by God, and like that young woman in the wilderness that Father Nick took on that hike, like the Israelites today in the first reading, and like Jesus who led his people out into this place where they were looking for proof. He points to the invisible reality who is God. And God, for their part in the gospel, was right in front of them. An infinite heart can only be satisfied by what is infinite, and that's God. When they reached the end of their trip in the wilderness, that young 20-year-old who had fallen into dehydration and disillusionment on the trip sat down when they finally got to the cars and said to Father Nick, "Do you know what? I'm really glad I came. Because I realized at some point on this trip, if I hadn't have gone, this week I would have sat on my couch and just watched television." The preference of comfort to greatness is always a temptation. The temptation to walk away from the church, the temptation to walk away from our vocation, from our calling, from our baptism is always strong and present when things get tough. But the opposite of grumbling, friends, is gratitude. I suppose as a young man, when I was asked to make my bed, I should have, rather than grumbled, said, "I thank God I have a bed to make." God will always give you reasons to be grateful in your life, even amidst the things that you may find uncomfortable. But the Lord is with us through it all. It was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. And we can trust that our real comfort lies in the greatness and the ability to stretch our hearts for God. The opposite of grumbling or rebellion is prayer. Why did they grumble? Why didn't they just ask? Why did they complain? Why didn't they just ask God for what they needed? We have to remember that there's a very fine line between those two things. When you have needs in your life, don't give up. Ask God for the strength to endure. And I just want to finish with this. And I try to remind our young people of this all the time, that God answers prayer in one of three ways always. He never says no. The first way he answers prayer is says, yes, you can have it. I very rarely counter this in my life, but it happens very frequently where a few weeks after I pray for something that the parish or we really need, it happens. It's thanks to your generosity too, of course. The second way God answers prayer is he says yes, but not right now. The third way God answers prayer is, I have something better in mind for you. I have something better in mind for you. And friends, it's always here. That God will always have something better in mind for us when we give up our own desires and plans. And so let's not forget that today, to trust God, to know that even difficult circumstances in life that require our faithfulness are just ways of God stretching our hearts and our capacity and ability to love, so that in heaven that capacity to receive it will also be increased. And let's ask God for an increase in the expansion of our hearts and gratitude for all we have today. And rather than complain when our times of need, we go to him in prayer and wait patiently for his response.